What is an example of the butterfly effect that happened in your life? My ex and I hadn't talked in years, having lived across the country from each other and dating other people in the meantime. There was a point where we were both single and mutual feelings were still there, so we decided to give it a try again. Things went horrible, but it was one of those situations where those what if feelings would have always been there had we not tried. I mean, we're talking like 10 years of history at this point. Anyways, I was in my hometown, where he lived, visiting, and he ended things, but asked me to stay in town for another day. I stayed. Didn't hear from him at all that next day and was hurt, but it showed me how toxic our relationship had become. So that night I went to my best friend's house to say goodbye, because I wouldn't be back in town until later in the year. I told her that after all those years of being hung up on one person, I was finally ready to move on. Her response? Good, there's someone we want you to meet. They invited said person over. I'd never met or heard of him. Flash forward 2 years, him and I are still together, about to move across the country with our 2 pups. If I hadn't been dumb enough to stay that extra night, I don't think I would have gotten fed up enough to tell myself that I deserved better, and I would have never been around to meet the love of my life. There are so many more dominoes that fell into place to get me to be there that night, but the biggest heartbreak of my life brought me the best thing that ever happened to me. Around 5 years ago, I was going to live in Australia for around a year, as part of a student exchange program. I would have been able to leave for Australia earlier, but I had troubles organizing my visa. The visa couldn't come from my national government for some reason, and had to go through the German bureaucracy. The delay meant that I had to leave 1 week later than originally planned. I had to reschedule flights, which was a large nuisance at the time. The original flight I would have been on would have been flight MH17 from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur. That was shot down with a rocket above Ukraine by pro-Russian separatists. Everybody on that flight had died. I took flight MH19 instead, thanks to the delay caused by slow bureaucracy. I would have died had I gotten my visa on time. A friend who worked in Madrid, as she got to the train station, the strap on her shoe broke, so she only lived 10 minutes away and went home for different shoes. In the 20 or so minutes it took her to go there, grab shoes and go back again, 193 people died and 2,000 were injured in bombs, including on the train she would have got on. I was in New York City for work and staying in Lower Manhattan, but just felt like it was too far from work. That's all I was there for. I was too busy for anything fun. Plus I've been to New York City numerous times before. So one night I just decided to move hotels closer to the office. The next morning in the new hotel I overslept and didn't wake up until about 9 AM. I made the switch on the evening of the 10th of September 2001 and had been staying at the Marriott World Trade Center. Drunkenly agreed at a party the night before to go visit my friend's parents with him the next day in a city 200 miles away. It turned out another friend lived close by, so we all met for drinks that evening, and said other's friend's sister happened to be visiting him for the weekend. She came to meet us as she'd not seen me for a few years. We got drunk. Friend left early as he had work the next day. His sister didn't. And 9 years later we are married with 2 kids. A series of events which, had one of any part not happened, would have significantly altered the course of my life. Kind of more my husband's story, but still interesting. His family moved to Canada when he was very young. Every year, they would send him to swim camp. But one year, when he was about 10, something went wrong and he was mistakenly enrolled in hockey camp. His family was from a country where ice skating wasn't a thing, and they hadn't embraced the whole Canadian culture of hockey. Not to mention that 10 years old is pretty late to be starting skating, let alone playing hockey. So they tried to switch him to another camp, but the mistake was noticed far too late and every other camp was full. It was hockey camp or nothing. So they decided to send him this 1 year only. Except that my husband ended up loving hockey and being quite good at it, and begged to go back the next year. From then on, he went to multiple hockey camps a year and started playing on a team. Fast forward many years and I'm out of province staying at a hotel for a hockey tournament my brother was competing in. I go down to the hotel pool and it's pretty busy as a lot of other families are staying there for the tournament. I end up talking with this one guy and we hit it off and are inseparable for the rest of the tournament. I even risked disownment and cheered when he scored against my own brother. The tournament ends and we stay in touch. Fast forward many years again and we're married, with my husband having made a career of playing professional hockey, all because he was signed up for the wrong sports camp. This is probably more a sliding doors, near miss thing than a butterfly effect one. All the way back in 1989, I was on a round the world trip. I had been traveling through Australia, Southeast Asia and China. To get back to Europe, I decided to take the Trans-Siberian Railway through Mongolia and what was then the Soviet Union. In pre-internet days and with China and the Soviet Union not exactly tourist-friendly countries at the time, this wasn't super easy. I had to organize all my own visas, train tickets, etc. When I got to Beijing, the hotel I stayed at had free loan bicycles and so I grabbed one and made my way around to the city to try and find the Mongolian embassy to get a visa. There was only one train running each week, so I was desperate to get this organized as soon as possible, partially because I was low on money, but I was also quite homesick by now. I'd already gotten a train ticket and a Soviet visa in Hong Kong, but I still needed a visa for Mongolia. Again, this is pre-internet, pre-Google Maps days. I had a street map but just couldn't find that bloody embassy. At long last I got lucky and found it, but by then they were just shutting the gates. Business hours were over for the day, at 3 PM. If I couldn't get a visa, I'd not be able to get on this week's train. My train ticket would be worthless and I'd have to wait a full week for the next train. Plus I'd need a new Soviet visa too. So I pleaded with the guard. Eventually he relented and let me in. There was still someone in the office and because they were keen to finish off for the day, they pretty much just put the sticker in my passport and shuffled me out the door. All set, I got on the train the next day and had an amazing time. Going through Mongolia, the Soviet Union, spent a few days in Moscow and then headed via Finland and Scandinavia back home. The week after I'd been on the Trans-Siberian train this happened. A massive gas explosion caused by a leaking gas pipeline and triggered by a passing train. Over 500 people died. If the Mongolian embassy guard hadn't let me through, I probably would have ended up being on that train. I have a similar but somewhat less exciting story. One day in 1999, I left my house in Streatham Hill, South London with my 2 kids to go shopping in Brixton for gym shoes for my oldest, then 8. Right as I was closing my front door, I realized that I didn't have my house keys and would not be able to get back in. I walked to the phone box and rang my sister-in-law, the nearest person with a spare set of keys. I asked her what time would be most convenient for her to come over and let me in, and the time she told me was in an hour. So I rushed off with the kids to get the shoes and hurried back. Had I had my keys, I would have lingered at the stores longer and gone and picked up some things at Brixton Market, but instead I rushed back to meet my Sil. As I got off the bus in Streatham Hill, I heard a loud bang that sounded like thunder. Later on I would find out it was a nail bomb, which had been left in Brixton Market, which I would have been in, with my 2 young kids, if I had not forgotten my key. Mum and father split when I had turned 15. Father remarried a few years later and with that I had a stepfamily. I put a good word in for my now stepsister where I worked. She was cool so thought I'd help her out. A few months later, her friend is looking for work and she puts a good work in for her. Her friend joins our workplace. I now have 2 children with her friend and couldn't be happier. With our own marriage to come very soon. Literally blows my mind to think that if my parents never split, I wouldn't have found my soulmate. 6 years ago, I decided to stay home instead of going to class because I was feeling sick. I was bored out of my mind and opened the App Store on my iPad to look for a game to download. For some reason, I still don't know, there was a karaoke app in the recommended section. I had never done karaoke, never sung in front of anyone before or let anyone hear me sing. For that matter, it took me about 4 months just to gather the courage to actually use it and sing. Because I've always been self-conscious about my voice, I made a lot of friends and sang a bunch. One of these friends showed me a song, just because it was in Spanish, my first language, from a user I didn't know or follow. I knew the song, but I never liked it so I didn't give it much thought and didn't sing it. The next day I remembered about it and said fuck it, I'll sing it anyways just because it's in Spanish. As soon as I heard her voice, I melted and fell in love with it. She thanked me for joining and that was it. Fast forward to today, I married the woman with the Spanish song I almost didn't sing. Moved to another country. Adopted a cat and I'm happier than I've ever been. I'm still amazed that the simplest decision I made out of boredom changed my whole life. A good friend of mine is only alive today because I sat down with him at a party and we got drunk together. I'd never met him before and I dunno, just sat down with him and cracked open a beer. Turns out he'd recently lost his father too and we bonded over the meaninglessness of existence. Years later he told me he'd planned to kill himself until I'd said nothing matters as long as you have beer and good company. 17 years later we're still here.